Hi, everybody. My name is Tony Vargas. I am very proud to be a state senator representing District 7 in the Nebraska Legislature. That is downtown in South Omaha. I've been serving since 2017, and I really proudly serve on appropriations. And the reason why we're here talking to you, is because I serve as the chair of the Planning Committee. And I get to work with a wonderful person that heads CPAR, Dr. Schafer.
Hi, I'm Josie Schafer. I'm the director of the Center for Public Affairs Research here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and we have worked with the Planning Committee since 2009. I've been working with the Planning Committee since 2018. This is my first year with Senator Vargas as chair, and in that role we put together data points that help us to understand Nebraska better and the changing demographics of Nebraska a little bit better. We present to the Planning Committee about once a month when they're out of session, when the legislature's out of session. And then we work with them to find new data points, do more in-depth policy analysis as they ask for it.
Yeah, so I'm really proud to be the chair of the Planning Committee, 9-member board. It has speaker, the head of the executive board, chair of appropriations, and 6 other members that are appointed by the executive board. And this committee came out of legislation from Senator Harms and years ago, so that we can do some more strategic planning as a body, which we don't do enough of in a structured way like this. And so Planning Committee serves a really important purpose, and we want to talk to you about some of those recommendations and really interesting data points that we talked over these last year with the committee and with Dr. Schafer and CPAR.
Sure. So usually what we do is, while they are all in session, we are pulling data together. We work with the United States Census Bureau as the lead agency in the State Data Center Network, so we know census data really well as other topics that have come up that we think might be important. In years past, we've done what's called the database, but it was actually a really thick book of lots of data tables. This year we've put a lot of that online by legislative district in Nebraska, cpar.unomha.edu/policy, so you can access those too. And then we pick out some highlights, some things that we think, some numbers on the move, some things that are kind of interesting, maybe stand out against our peer states or have changed pretty significantly from from years past. And we present, usually PowerPoint style, some graphs and tables. We think of everything as like a draft, right? This is something we're seeing. Do you see it too? Do you think this is interesting? What do you want to know more about? And then we get feedback from the committee. We never really move to finalize anything, but most of it is data, most of it is facts. It's not really something that needs to be discussed, but as the session evolved, we got a little deeper into the data to start to understand how other states are dealing with some of the trends and issues that we're seeing. So I wanted to start just by discussing some of those real overview, kind of big numbers we presented early on. We have a map online that looks at Nebraska's population, and if the 2018 data from the United States Census Bureau came out just a couple weeks ago, so the 2018 numbers are now available, but since 2010 the population's grown about 5%, but 66 counties have lost population. So across Nebraska, most of the counties are losing population, and we actually can see a trend in one of our graphs where people are leaving rural counties and heading to urban counties. So most of that 5% growth is in our urban counties. Another trend that we're seeing, the proportion of the population aged 25 to 64 is shrinking, while that 65 plus is expanding pretty drastically. We actually have a graph that's looking at that 25 to 64 as our prime age workforce, and we're actually seeing that number really decline pretty rapidly. This is the first time that the number of people aged 75 and over is the same as the number of people 5 and under.
Really?
Right? Yeah.
Oh gosh.
So pretty drastic changes, both in like the size of our population and then the proportions of that population by age. Another one on migration that has gotten a lot of attention. We look at people coming into the state and people leaving the state by education, and we see that most people leaving the state have a bachelor's degree or higher, while folks coming in tend to have an associate's degree or bachelor's degree. So that one has gotten a lot of attention, I think, throughout Nebraska. Our poverty rate is about 12%. It's pretty comparable to a lot of other states, but for children under age 5, the poverty rate is a little bit higher at 18.6. and one that I've been asked about a lot is the 65 and over population in rural Nebraska has a pretty high poverty rate compared to that 65 plus in the urban areas. What else have we talked about? We're going to talk a lot about rainy day funds. John Bartle, the Dean of the College of Public Affairs and Community Service, is a fiscal policy expert, and so he's talked a lot about rainy day funds throughout. Hot topic this year was workforce. Couple points on that. We have a really high workforce participation rate. Most of the Midwest does, but ours really stands out. But on the flip side of that, our job growth rate is really low. It was about 1.2%, and some recent months have even been lower. So everybody working, but not a lot of growth in jobs. So we have almost, a lot of people talk about the unemployment rate. We want a low unemployment rate. Of course we do. We want everyone working, but we don't have that slack to create new jobs. The occupations with some of the largest projected growth are also high wage jobs in healthcare, computers, and math. We have a pretty complicated graph where we actually look at projections of number of people needed in occupations, and the growth is mostly in high wage jobs as compared to low wage jobs. 377,453, about 30% of the population does have a bachelor's degree. So when we talk about that brain drain, it's only about 1,500 to 2,000 folks leaving a year with bachelor's degrees. Still seems like we have a lot here. But one of the data points I suggested this year, there's been some estimates actually from Georgetown University's Workforce and Education Center that suggested that the new economy, the economy of 2020, which we're here, requires 35% of the population to have a bachelor's degree. So we're at 30% statewide, and just a couple places have that concentration of 35% or more. Funny enough, places that are still growing.
There's a lot of need. There's a lot of changing landscape, and this is why this is so helpful. So over the course of the year, Dr. Schafer and Dr. Bartle at times also came in and presented these data points. And part of our job as legislators has been trying to dig in and make meaning out of this for us. What does this drive us to want to learn more about? What policy areas does this want us to then investigate further? I'll tell you, coming out of this, and this will get a little bit into the recommendations, but as you can see, the changing demographics away from rural and urban Nebraska are a concern. If we do nothing, we know where this is headed. And if we don't want to do anything, then that we know what's going to happen. If we do want to do something, which will lead to some recommendations, because Nebraska still is a more rural agricultural state, that's our main economy right now, next to manufacturing, then we need to do something. So it led us to then come up with some recommendations in that area. We also had big conversations about the aging population. So yes, for the first time, we're seeing this. We have this wide range of age, 25 to 65, that is the working group, but we have a lot more baby boomers that are at an age where they need more healthcare needs. They may still be working, but
we do have a very high rate of, I think it's 55 to 64, like the second highest rate in the country of 55 to 64 in the workforce. And that could be great for some folks, but it could mean that their wages haven't kept up with their lifestyle and they're not able to retire at the age that they might normally.
Yeah, so it's a little bit, right, we don't know exactly. So the question we have as legislators is, do we do anything legislatively to support or try to address a problem that's coming up? And one aspect of that is there are healthcare needs for an older population. If we do want, or if some of that workforce that is aging, that are still working, do we need to figure out another way that supplies a certain type of jobs for them? What are the growing needs for this specific age bracket? The other questions we had coming out of this outward migration of individuals with bachelor's degrees is, what do we do? Should we be trying to retain more of these individuals? What does that say about us as a state if we're not retaining a certain higher educated workforce? And when what we're getting in is still an educated workforce, but with less years of postgraduate or post-undergrad education. And so it got us to a lot of different places.
And I'll say that migration trend is really interesting because the jobs that we have, like I was saying, we have a lot of lower wage jobs now, and I think I cut off low wage jobs at under $40,000 individual income. So our economy right now supports folks coming in with less than a bachelor's degrees. They can find jobs here. We actually have some wage graphs that say too, at the lower ends of the income scale, those are higher compared to some of our neighbor states. But when we get to the upper end of income, some of those are lower end. So I'm not surprised at all that we see folks with the associate's degrees, some college, high school degrees coming in.
Jobs.
They can find jobs, and they're fairly good wage jobs right now. But those bachelor's degrees, I can totally see why they're leaving. The wages aren't there, and the job growth in the areas that they might work isn't there.
We had a lot of great conversations, and this led to a lot of discourse and some recommendations. So we might as well jump into some of the recommendations, because I think that's helpful. Okay, so Dr. Buttle was really great about focusing on some of the fiscal policy side of this. 2 years ago, we focused on rainy day fund. Our recommendation for the rainy day fund, it's basically like our savings account for the state of Nebraska. It was to make sure we're not taking more money from it. It was essentially the recommendation, and even look at some policies to support it. We didn't end up passing any policies to support it outside of some long-term budgeting, which is a bill that I brought last year. But recommendations that we were really looking at are, how can we make sure that this funding mechanism, that we have a certain percentage of basically cash on hand in the rainy day fund in case anything happens to the state of Nebraska. I think the assumption is that there is a policy that drives exactly how much we should have in this fund, and there isn't right now. Or at what instances do we or do we not access this specific fund? What do we do if we do access it? How do you then make sure that we're putting money back into it? There are some practices that we've utilized that dictate, and within our committees, like appropriations, to then what we can do, but we don't have policies that dictate that. And so we're looking at recommendations right now on policies that will support making the rainy day fund healthier. Obviously, we want a good savings account for the state of Nebraska, and this is making it and strengthening that. Rural development. So
came up a lot.
It came up a ton. I was trying to think of, so 66% of counties.
So 66 counties.
66 counties in Nebraska
have lost population. All of them, what we might think of as rural, just not having a population over 10,000 in the whole county.
Yeah. So in addition to the rainy day fund, there were 4 recommendations that we came up with. I want to dive into rural development, but I just want to state the other 4. So we have rainy day fund, basically improving that, looking at ways to prioritize rural development, retaining and attracting 18 to 34-year-olds, workforce training, and improving K through 12 or birth through 12 educational outcomes. So those are the things we talked about. Well, rural development came up because of that specific statistic. We are losing populations in rural Nebraska. And I think the consensus of the committee, and you can chime in here with this, the consensus of the committee, I felt like, is if we don't do something, we're going to continue to see rural Nebraska disappear. And we still have jobs out in rural Nebraska. We still have our major economic drivers in our state still are outside of the urban city areas. And if we don't figure out ways to strategically prioritize and support economic growth in these areas, we are missing out on what makes Nebraska, Nebraska. And so that was a really strong recommendation coming out of this committee.
Yeah, I would just second that. I don't think it was about changing the character of rural development, but supporting rural development. So, for instance, in that context, broadband came up, and rural folks wanting rural Nebraskans to have access to the internet, high-speed access to the internet, even being able to support remote workers who choose to live in rural Nebraska but might work in a city business. Yeah.
So, broadband is really important. As Dr. Schafer said, remote workers we did talk about affordable housing as not just an urban issue, which sometimes comes up. It's also a rural issue, making sure that affordability is also depends on where you're living, and so making some sort of efforts to improve housing.
In that context, too, Senator Matt Williams asked me to look a little bit more into that. We have really low housing stock in most of rural Nebraska. There's no new development, and so some houses come off the market because people own them, people are in them for a long time, they stay in a family, some are not kept up to date, and so you need new houses to attract new folks to those communities.
Yeah, so there's what's an effort to then prioritize urban and rural, affordable and or workforce housing that's meeting the needs of a community. That's something that we talked about. And then rural development is, we haven't set on what policy we're going to support, but making the recommendation to the entire legislature that this is important was one of the things that we wanted to prioritize. Retaining and attracting 18 to 34-year-olds. So this out-migration, specifically of people with bachelor's degrees, concerned a lot of members of the committee. If we're going to continue to grow, and I think the state of Nebraska is about 1.9 million, and we want to continue to this 25 to 65 sort of workforce age bracket, we need to retain individuals in the state and from all different walks of life. But what can we do to then support this? So we started talking about that, and some of the different policy, or at least the outcomes we wanted, was a net positive in migration of people with bachelor's degrees. Higher median incomes across the state. I can't remember some of the statistics on the median income right now. I don't know if you remember off the top of your head. I'm testing your data.
Yeah, I think it's 54,000, but I don't want to.
That sounds right.
Okay.
You talked about high wage jobs and high skill jobs before. So the terminology here is H3 jobs, high wage, high skill, high demand jobs. There are a lot of those in the state of Nebraska. Probably not enough yet to even meet our demand, but there are a lot of vacant H3 jobs that exist in our state.
I think that's a really fair statement. And so the Nebraska Department of Labor puts out numbers pretty regularly about that. And you see sort of the jobs that most people are trying to fill tend to be high wage jobs. And again, it makes sense because we're losing some of that population with their bachelor's degrees leaving.
So we talked about that as a way to retain and attract 18, 34-year-olds. Growth in value-added technology jobs was also something else that came out of this. And one of the things that we talked about was, and it's really hard to sort of quantify this, but most of the committee agreed that we want to create a more inclusive and welcoming Nebraska, and that there's a need to look at policies that do that, because if we can't do that, we are competing against some other big cities and other states that are attracting people with bachelor's degrees. So we are competing with, in my opinion, the Des Moines of the world, the Colorados of the world, the Denvers of the world, the Kansas City, Missouris of the world, and making sure we're keeping ahead of the game on policies that are supporting diverse and inclusive communities and spaces, and culture is really important for the state of Nebraska. And so we talked about that as a...
Education came up a lot in that context too. Right? Yeah. I think, again, it was Senator Williams saying we need a safe place to live and we need great education for our kids. Otherwise, people aren't going to want to come.
Yes. Workforce training. This came up as pretty unanimous from the entire committee that we need to do more. We're not the only committee or entity that's working in this space of workforce. I know Senator Bowles and Chair Senator Arch, the Vice Chair Senator Arch and Chair Bowles for the Economic Development Task Force has been working on what we can do in workforce training. That's one of the sub-priorities. I know different nonprofit groups outside of the legislature have been working on workforce training. The way that we talked about this is a couple different things: growth in community college technology programs, lower unemployment and underemployment rate, and the number of people working with more than one job. I forget the statistic, sure, but the percentage of individuals working 2 or more jobs that are still living in poverty, we are very, very high as a state.
Yeah, so folks working one or more jobs, that's a high. We're in the top 5 in the country in that rate. And then working poor, so someone in the household working full-time year-round and still in poverty, another really high rate compared to other states. And so workforce training has a lot of potential to help folks to get to the next level of education. So for instance, we see a big jump in income when you get an associate's degrees. So someone with some college is around $34,000 a year, jumps up to $40,000 with a median income. Well, that would put us over that high wage line and say someone could have a good family life here in Nebraska making over that. So we want to push folks to associate's degrees. We also really want to push folks into training in those STEM areas, in sort of new technologies, computer, math, and healthcare all have a lot of potential at that level of education to raise incomes. And so workforce training can solve that puzzle for us.
And so we really try to focus on the workforce training defined that way. Reduction in the number of unfilled jobs, increasing the number of technology jobs and employment, lower underemployment rate, growth in community tech college technology jobs, because I think that those sort of outcomes we talked about are going to drive some significant change for the state of Nebraska. The last one, which is, I think, foundation for a lot of these, is improving our K through 12 educational outcomes. When we look at our system, there was a lot of data that tells us that although on average our educational outcomes for a state are above average in comparison to all other states, when you start to hone into the data on the specific subpopulations that are areas of focus, individuals in poverty across urban and rural Nebraska, individuals that may speak a different language or are from an underrepresented ethnicity or race, and those individuals that might tend to also then not be unemployed or underemployed. Those are the individuals we want to make sure are also getting the best possible K through 12 educational outcomes as possible. So, improving K through 12 educational outcomes, we have a couple different things. Increased proficiency rates in 3rd, 8th grade, and 11th grade. We have these tests at the state level. They're really helpful metrics to see where we can grow. Increased GED equivalency passage. Increased coverage of needed and prioritized educational services, and decreasing the absence and truancy rate. This was a good conversation that we actually had at the data conference about educational outcomes here in Omaha.
Yeah. It's an extremely important question. I think it underlines a lot of the topics we're talking about in a lot of different ways. Data in the education outcome space is actually really hard to get our hands on. We did some analysis of the finances this year. It was a lively conversation.
Yes, it was.
But I think the main point there is that we don't see, it's not more money, more outcomes necessarily. And it's not you spend too much, stop doing that. We want to think about how much you spend to get the outcomes you want. And so there will be some effort in future years to tie that finance piece to the outcomes piece to start to understand it.
No, that's a great point, because I think on either end of, there's people that ideologically think that we need more money to then meet educational outcomes, and others that think don't stop throwing money at educational outcomes because it's not a good investment. Neither of those things are true, and I think the details of what is good policy, how do we use data to drive good outcomes in the education system, we're lucky that we're starting to do that and we have the metrics. Maybe not where we need to be quite yet. And as a legislature, we have prioritized that this is something that we need to invest in terms of policy, not just funding. And so K through 12 educational outcomes, if we don't get that right, that is the one of these 5 that is the farthest upstream. If we don't get that right, all the other things will not stand on their own. And so that's why we prioritize K through 12 educational outcomes as well.
I'm going to throw out one more data point. Too.
Go, yeah, please.
I think it will be interesting in conversations possibly coming this year. So 56% of funding for Nebraska schools comes from property taxes. Not saying if that's bad or good, but the average is 40%. So we're really high on the amount of funding for education that comes from property taxes. And that essentially means a local school district's property taxes are funding 56, more than half of that school's funding more than half of that school's expenditures. And so we can think about variation in capacity across the state. And that becomes sort of interesting in how, that's why we need to ask this question of how does money turn into outcomes, because we don't have the same amount across all our school districts.
Yeah, that is going to be an interesting conversation this session.
I will be there.
Yeah. And the only thing I'll say about this is, part of the conversations we have are on looking at the data. And if we notice that there's an over-reliance on property taxes, as an appropriator, I want to make sure that any program that we have has the funding it needs to meet its outcomes. So if there's ever a moment that we redistribute funding and property taxes so we're less reliant, I think we're always looking to make sure that there's some equity in how we fund our programs and services so that Nebraska can continue to grow. The way we do that depends on me and 48 other senators. And so make sure to voice your opinions or concerns in regards to any of these things that we're sharing with your senators. It's just helpful for you to be able to, be educated and then also hold us accountable. A couple of the different policy legislations in these different arenas that I thought were really helpful. There were some really good rainy day fund policies that look at having a certain percentage that we have in the rainy day fund at the end of the 2-year cycle, creating a formula for basically how much and how much we put into the rainy day fund, and
there's also ones on when to put money
yeah,
into the
so
rainy day
at
fund.
what point, yeah.
So looking at the volatility, so what receipts, what taxes are coming in and when, and so if we expect that they won't come in, to put money in ahead of that. So very planning committee oriented kind of policy.
Yeah. Rural development, there are some really good ideas specific to other states that have passed legislation that provides some sort of incentive or economic development incentives in rural Nebraska. There was a rural opportunity zone program in Kansas, business incentive program in Kentucky, and one longstanding one is a grant program, the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is really interesting. And then the Wisconsin Legislature's Rural Initiative. So we had really good ideas.
Utah as well has a couple programs for rural economic development that were kind of interesting.
Yes. So we have really good ideas and models of what we can look for to then potentially pass legislation in this area. We're training and attacking 18 to 35-year-olds. I don't know if you want to talk about some of these different incubator ideas.
Well, so I think one attempt that has been made that has been pretty strong is in Georgia, and it's their Hope Scholarship. So certain GPA, certain ACT or SAT scores in Georgia, and you can go to any Georgia school, higher education, post-secondary institution for free. And the idea behind that is to keep Georgians in Georgia. And so that would certainly retain, or could have the potential to retain 18 to 35-year-olds, 34-year-olds. Also really focusing on the job growth piece. What has been done to generate jobs? And again, there's a whole committee working on economic development incentives. And so staying away from that and thinking about it more broadly was this idea of an ecosystem approach to jobs. And so that's sometimes called clusters, and it's attracting industries that then attract their competitors and their collaborators. And we have some potential in that in healthcare as well as agricultural technology, and what we might have to do to develop that ecosystem to really build an opportunity for them to grow. I think we also really talked about supporting businesses here to grow here.
Yep. One other thing that we looked at in regards to training and attracting 18 to 35-year-olds sort of piggybacks on this incentive or scholarships. We looked at loans forgiveness programs. The committee wanted to look at targeting low-income individuals or somehow tying loan forgiveness or an incentive to working an H3 job, or also even tying this to rural development, having people live and work and find a place in a more rural community in Nebraska. And so
there are some models for that.
Yeah,
I think
which is great.
Really interesting. I think too, Tennessee offers free associate's degrees.
Oh,
so
yeah.
another real opportunity for us.
So we got some more work to do. And the last piece of this was looking at policies that support vibrant, diverse, and inclusive communities. Because I think that's intangible, sometimes hard to quantify, are really important for this age group as well. Workforce training, career academies came up, and I know you presented some examples of that.
Yeah, so Grand Island, Nebraska has actually been touted for one of their career academies, but programs in high schools that help students develop skills for a career, help them find careers in those high demand jobs, and get them ready for the workforce sooner, are all there's lots of opportunity there. And we saw some apprenticeship programs big in both Connecticut and Florida, celebrated for their types of programs. Georgia and Massachusetts having work-based programs in schools as well. There's some incentives for those kind of programs, wage subsidies. There's lots of different ways to do it. We saw a diversity, but there's actually one map that highlights what states are doing in terms of workforce training, and Nebraska stood out there because we didn't really have any sort of statewide program.
It's a huge area of opportunity, and I know this committee is not the only committee that is committed to looking at those different ideas. I know the Economic Development Task Force is as well.
Yeah, and it's workforce. I've only been here a short time with the Planning Committee, but I'll tell you, all of these have come up every year, and the trends have been strong over time, and so on a couple of these to move to the policy level, I think people are pretty ready.
So that's what we've been working on as a planning committee. I'm thankful that we have Dr. Schafer and CPAR and Dr. Bartle as well that are helping us to make sure we have the right data available and we're making the best decisions with. I want to make sure the public really knows that we're not experts in everything that we do as senators. We just cannot be. But one of the ways that we try to become experts is by relying on individuals that do have expertise and really being as data-driven as possible. And so I think the Planning Committee is a prime example of us trying to be data-driven on how we're making decisions in the state of Nebraska. We will have some more work this year to dive into some more specific policy recommendations and use our designation in a strong way to support some of these recommendations in these 5 areas. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of the year. And then hopefully educate people on some other changing demographic changes, data points that are really interesting. But in the meantime, thank you for coming out. Thank Dr. Schafer for talking with me and having coffee in her office here.
Thank you.
And thank everybody for being informed about the Planning Committee.